Thank you. We have spent the last 5 weeks in this class examining the baptismal covenant. And then last time we met, David went over the Holy Week. So this week we'll be extremely non-spiritual. This has nothing to do with that. But when I was asked to present, well, as I'm sure you know, this church was named Heavenly Rest by a woman in New York. And she was familiar with this church, which is Heavenly Rest in New York City. When I was asked to present, they did not specify if I was to give the history of this church or that church. But I have chosen to talk about this church. However, just so you know, that church was founded in 1865 as a result of the Civil War. It was founded as a memorial to the soldiers who lost their life in that conflict, and that's why it has that cemetery-sounding name, Heavenly Rest. When it opened on Fifth Avenue, it was on 45th Street. And when it opened, of course, this church had yet come to be. One interesting tidbit is that President Chester Arthur's funeral was in that church. You can tuck that away for later. But then on Easter Sunday of 1929, Heavenly Rest New York moved uptown, and they opened their new church 45 blocks north on some of the most expensive real estate on the planet. They're on Fifth Avenue at 90th, facing Central Park, right across from the old Carnegie Mansion, the Cooper Hewitt Museum today. And you can see there's their sign on the corner, and here it is zoomed in. And I only point that out because that very fashionable copper sign on Fifth Avenue, we have one just like it on not so fashionable 6th Street here. But I will say they have nothing on us when it comes to beautiful architecture, for sure. In fact, Russell Wyndham, who was the architect of this space with Wyndham and Curtis out of Houston, and they do really a lot of Gothic type construction and architectural design. He had never been to this campus, and he was unaware of it when he came here about 10 years ago to talk about the commission for this. And when he saw the nave, he said, of all the buildings, not only church buildings in Texas, this is one of the best that I have ever seen. He said the exterior is a grand gesture, and Froman's Tower is soaring but modest like the people of Abilene. So he was sucking up to us too, but I have to admit though, when I'm sitting out there and I'm listening to someone up here, sometimes my mind does wander, and I think about things in this space, such as that mosaic that you cannot see because it's now hidden behind that screen. So here it is. It is not the oldest relic here at the church, but it is in the top 5. And we did not just go pick that thing up at Hobby Lobby. That has some meaning to it. It is an 18th century azulejo. And azulejo is a Portuguese tile mosaic. If you have been to Portugal, which I have not, you will see them everywhere. They are ubiquitous. In fact, these in this church are thought to have been made by the same artist who did the one that's behind the screen up there. It was Mary Lou Robertson, a long time, in fact, a lifetime member of this church who has just recently passed away, who I'm told spotted that in an antique shop here. It was for sale by the estate of Tim McClellan. And I don't know, David, you can tell me if I'm wrong. I don't know if they donated it or the church bought it, but either way, she was wise in thinking that it would look terrific there, and it does. As you can see, it is the Magi coming to greet the Holy Child. And I'm not sure why it's off-centered like that. That tree on the far side probably has some meaning. I just don't know what that is. Also, if you're just a little bit OCD, there are 216 tiles up there. And I only know that because I'm a little bit OCD. And above it, there's got to be the finest screen disguise of all time, don't you think? That I've often sat out there and wondered, did they have to cut the spires off the ends of that thing to fit in that arch right there? Because you see it's got the 6 spires, but the ones on the end, there's not. Several of our past parishioners here have written histories of this church. Mamie Thompson wrote one in 1921. A lady by the name of Fanny Digby Roberts, who a lot of stuff on the in the chapel and on the in the chancel are given by her family. She wrote one in 1931. Jewel Scarborough wrote one in 1962. A guy named Leland Potter wrote his Hardin Simmons master's thesis about it. But Jewel Scarborough, as I'm sure many of you know, is the grandmother-in-law of Candy. It was Charles's grandmother. She joined this church in 1918 with her, or 1919 with her son Davis. Her husband joined later. When he finally joined, he told a friend that he finally had found a church that he was looking for, one that had no politics and very little religion. So that may be why you're here as well. I don't know. But here's the Abilene News as reported in the Dallas paper in August of 1882. It says at the bottom, the Abilene High School employs 3 new teachers for next year, guaranteeing them good salaries. I worked there for 30 years, and that's not true. Says that the Methodists are constructing a very stylish church edifice. And the first one was this: the Episcopal Festival here last night was largely attended. I am not sure what happens at an Episcopal festival, but we put one on 143 years ago. And this is the very first newspaper mention that I can find of any sort of Episcopalian activity here in Abilene. But when Abilene was born in 1881, there was only one Episcopal church between Fort Worth and El Paso, and that was All Saints, which is in Weatherford, later the home church of Larry Hagman, which if you're under 50, that means nothing to you in here. But this church would be the second church west of Fort Worth. But we got to back up just a little bit, because the very first service of the Episcopal Church in this part of the state took place in 1878, before Abilene was even born. It was held in this log cabin. It was the home of Captain John Trent and his wife Mary. It's south of Abilene, near Dudley, just over the Callahan County line there. Bishop Alexander Garrett, who was the bishop over what was then called the Diocese of Texas, which encompassed the whole state. As you know, there is still a Diocese of Texas, which does not encompass the whole state, and I find that very confusing. But Bishop Garrett had actually met the Trents in Dallas in 1875 as they prepared to move out to this part of the world, and he promised that he would come out and conduct services for them. So in 1877, he rode out on horseback, but after considerable searching, he was unable to find the Trents because he did not get a Wi-Fi signal. His GPS didn't work, but he was determined to come back. So he came back the next year in 1878, and this time he did in fact find the elusive Trent family, and that is where the very first Eucharist took place. Another tidbit for you: if you know a lady here in town named Mary Corn, she is the great-great-granddaughter of the Trents. But 54 years after that service, and on that exact same spot, in fact, on top of where the Trents' fireplace was, there is a marker that was set to commemorate that first service, and the Trents' daughter pulled the cover from the monument there on the left. The whole thing was the idea of Parson Gerhardt of Heavenly Rest, and that's him standing by it. It's no small marker. It is 16 feet tall, and he was not a tall man. The initial plans called for that to be designed by Louis Tiffany of New York, and it was to be sculpted out of Luder's limestone. But it was to be modeled after this monument, which is in a cemetery in Plainfield, New Jersey. But with the onset of the Great Depression, that whole project got scaled back quite a bit. And so Tiffany did not draw the design. Instead, it was designed by an Abilene engineer named Henry Fowler, and it's not sculpted from Luder's limestone, it's cast concrete. It was dedicated in 1932, which was just 2 days before what would have been the 100th birthday of Bishop Garrett. And tucked away inside that monument is the Bible that he used that day at the service in the Trents' home. And if you've not been there, it's a nice outing. It's 17 miles south of here. You go down Highway 36 and then turn to go to Dudley. You can't miss it. You have to climb over a stile, dig it over the fence, and you walk about 50 yards out to it. And there are inscriptions on the sides of it from Bishop Garrett's diary. But 3 years after Bishop Garrett, his trip out here in 1878 is when Abilene was founded in March of 1881. And just 9 months after that, in November, these two fellows, Edward Starkey Keene and Dr. J.M. Isbell, who apparently never uploaded his picture to the internet, they wrote to Bishop Garrett, who, as you can see, is now older. And they wrote to him requesting his permission to form a mission church here, and he agreed. Keene and Isbell named their mission church St. Paul's Mission. And they began meeting in the first school building we had here, which was down on Cedar Street. Bishop Garrett, though, would often travel back east to raise funds for his diocese. He would go to New York and Philadelphia and Boston. And on one trip in either 1882 or 1883, he met a woman named Mary Burgess from Brookline, Massachusetts. And she told him that she would donate $1,500 to whichever church west of Weatherford matched her gift. She also told Garrett that the church should be built of stone and that she would like to choose the name, and the name she chose was Heavenly Rest, just as the New York church. So Bishop Garrett came back to Texas. He came to Abilene. He urged Starkey Keene and Dr. Isabel to raise the additional money to match her gift so that it would come here. And he also secured a second gift, and it might have been from Mrs. Burgess, we don't know, but from someone who requested that the church be built as a memorial to a woman named Caroline Colby of Massachusetts. Anyway, we raised the money. We received the gift from Mrs. Burgess. Ground was broken for that first church in 1883, and it was actually designed, the church was designed by Bishop Garrett. The landscaping wasn't designed by anybody, but Bishop Garrett came for the setting of the cornerstone, which took place December the 11th of 1883, and that is the date that we have on the sign. However, the cornerstone itself says 1884 because they knew that the church wouldn't be completed or finished until that year. The paper reported this: the cornerstone of the new Episcopal Church was laid here by Bishop Garrett last Tuesday. The church will be of stone and quite an ornament to the city. In all, it cost $6,000. Jane Campbell, who later married Starkey Keene, recalled later years that when she moved to Abilene in 1883, she attended the setting of that stone in that little stone church downtown. And by May of 1884, it was finished, and Bishop Garrett came out to conduct the very first services. And for 25 years, it was the only church in Abilene that was not made out of wood. The church was on the corner at North 3rd and Orange Street. It faced west. It would face today what is North's Funeral Home. It's on the side of the Sanctuary of First Baptist Church. That little wooden structure right there was added in 1887, and it housed a bell. 1887 was the year that Starkey Keene and Jane Campbell got married. He was considered, by the way, the best dancer in Abilene. But what came as a surprise to everyone was at the end of the ceremony, a bell began to ring. And most people did not know the bell had arrived and had been put up there in the belfry, so it was quite a shock to them. It was paid for by the youth of this church. Their name was the Shepherdess Band. And when we moved down here, don't worry, we brought the bell with us. It is over there on the first floor of the bell tower. And it says on it, Shepherdess Band has got the list. It's presented by 7 names, one of them being Francis Torrey, who later wrote a history of this place. But here's a look inside that little stone church as it was known. In fact, this is Jane Starkey Keene singing in the choir. Other things in this picture that we still have, these candelabras right here, were given by the Cresswells, and Candy Scarborough told me that they're still in a closet here somewhere. I don't know if anybody knows where they're at. This processional cross is still part of our services. The brass eagle lectern, which was made by the Gorham Foundry in Rhode Island, is now there in the front of the chapel. These same 2 chairs are still flanking the altar in the nave, and that baptismal font is now in the chapel. Those are the original pews of the church, but the church was enlarged and remodeled in 1916, and it is those pews that are now in the chapel. That walnut altar and the cross that you see beneath the window, both were given by Sarah Walsh in 1909 in memory of her husband, George. On the east wall of that little rock church was a window known as the Good Shepherd window. It shows Jesus holding a lamb. It was actually imported from Germany, and it was installed as a memorial to this Caroline Colby, she actually died in Germany in 1879 before she was 46 years old. She's buried in Massachusetts. So she actually died before Abilene or this church even came to be. The uninsurable Good Shepherd window was removed from the downtown church when we moved here, and it was reset in the east wall of the chapel, and you should go look at it sometime. And I say it's uninsurable because it cannot be replaced. It was valued as being priceless. On it are the symbols of the 4 evangelists, Matthew there as the winged man, Mark as the lion, Luke as the ox, and John as the eagle down there. And at the very bottom of that main window, you'll see the inscription saying that this church was put up in memory of Caroline Colby. Before we leave the chapel, on the opposite wall is the resurrection or the Easter window. It was given by Eula Smith in the 1930s in memory of her husband, Will Stith. And yes, Stith, Texas is named for them. In fact, Eula, Texas is named for her. On the left side, you see the caduceus. Lieutenant Arthur Brown, who was a doctor here, was killed in World War I. His parents gave that window. The window on the other side with the flag in it is a memorial to all who lost their life in Abilene in World War I. The smaller windows from the old church were the wrong size for the new openings in this chapel, so Judson Studios in Los Angeles reworked and reinstalled the chapel windows. It was over their protest that Parson Gerhardt insisted that there be protective glass over the outside of those windows. Judson wanted the West Texas wind and sand to blow and to polish them to a greater brilliance. Parson wanted to protect them from Abilene hailstones, so he was a pretty smart man. But the two reworked windows are on the south wall there. Christ Knocking at the Heart's Door is one of them. It was given in 1927 in memory of Elizabeth Payne, who died from asthma at the age of 48. And Elizabeth Payne is the paternal grandmother of Bishop Claude Payne. The other window is the reason I sit on the sixth pew in the nave, because from that pew you can see, or you have a great view of the St. Cecilia window in the chapel. She is the patron saint of music. Paul Simon of Simon and Garfunkel said she was at least partly the inspiration for their song, Cecilia. This is her when that window was installed in the church downtown. You can see it's got a different shape to it there. But she's seated at an organ. However, to me, it looks like an electric organ, which makes no sense because she lived in the 200s. But 17 months after this church was finished, Dr. George Higgins became the missionary in charge in October of 1884. He was part-time because he was actually also an actual doctor here. He conducted services twice a month, but he was a short-timer, as were most of our early priests. In the first 15 years, there were almost 5 years that there was no priest, and in the other 10, we ran through 7 of them, like Bluebell ice cream. We just ran right through them. But in her 1921 history of the church, Mamie Thompson, who I wished I knew, had known, recalled the first rectors. And here's what she said. She wrote, Dr. Higgins was our first rector who made such a bad impression on him, he left and then left the ministry. Mr. Min Turner was the second rector. We worried him until he had softening of the brain and left. Mr. A.T. Delircy came next. He was a Russian anarchist. Our fourth rector was Dr. George White, who had such an ungovernable temper that we were all glad when he left. She must have liked number 5, who was Robert Stewart, because all she wrote was that he had an interesting family. He also was the clergy who stood next to the condemned William Frizzell, who he stood to be hanged in Abilene, the only hanging that ever took place in Taylor County, but he stood next to him that day. Rector number 6 was Mr. Ellsworth Perry. He wore, you see him around town, he wore a hat like Abraham Lincoln used to wear, and also broadcloth shirts. Finally, with number 7, Mamie Thompson was a little bit happier. James Walter Keeble was the rector here for 9 years, and under him is when Heavenly Rest became a parish. And it was only due to his really declining health that he stepped down. Many of you know Bill Keeble, who lives just down the street here. He is the great-grandson of James W. Keeble. After Keeble, we had Reverend Ernest Allman and then A.D. Ellis. But in 1920, the church welcomed the 10th rector, Willis Piedmont Gerhardt, better known as Parson Gerhardt, of course, for whom this hall is named. And I've given presentations on his life, so I'm not going to go into a lot of great detail about that. But he came here as a bachelor. 20 years after he arrived, when he was 50, in 1940, he married, and his wife was Eleanor Duell. She was raised as an Episcopalian because her father was the longtime rector of Trinity Episcopal in Santa Barbara, California. Before they were married, though, Parson had made a trip to Europe in 1926, and he was greatly affected by the churches that he saw there, and he returned here with the dream to crown Abilene's highest point with the Gothic church. He also was smart enough to bide his time on that. In 1948, he and Eleanor made a visit to California. That's them with their 2 sons, John and Harry. One of the things they liked to do was to visit other churches and to admire the architecture. In fact, before he decided to become a priest, Parson Gerhardt wanted to become an architect. One of the churches they visited was St. Thomas the Apostle in Hollywood. It's on Hollywood Boulevard, and it might look familiar to you. They even have the requisite copper sign at that church. I don't know what that is about those signs, but Parson wanted to know who the architect was of that church, and it took him several letters, which we still have in the files here, to find out that Harold Martin had designed the church, and rather coincidentally, the church led by Parson's father-in-law. Trinity had also been designed by Martin at a time when his partner was Philip Froman there in California. Froman would then move to Washington, D.C. in the 1920s and was the architect in residence at the National Cathedral. But Parson wrote to Martin, asking him if he would accept the commission to design Heavenly Rest, and Martin did, in fact, agree. The last service at the Little Stone Church was on Easter Sunday of 1951, and the following Sunday services moved here to this site, and they were held in the Quonset hut, which is just right here where the music center is today. That was our temporary church. In fact, it was known as the church for a little while. And we sold the downtown property to First Baptist. Right over there on this hill was a home, the Leggett home, often called the Leggett Mansion, 19-room home. And in fact, I would say that the photographer was standing just about where I'm standing right now to take that picture. The Leggett's granddaughter is the namesake of the building that today houses the music center. So Judy Matthews was a lifelong member of this church. In fact, she's interred in the columbarium behind it. But the church was built in stages. The first stage was the parish house, which is right across the courtyard there. It's the one with those copper doors on it. I have no idea why they're copper, but if you do, I'd like to know. The groundbreaking for that building, the very first building, was held in February of 1951. And helping Parson turn the dirt that day is 88-year-old Mrs. Starkey Keene, who still was a member here. The chapel was built next. There was a talk of having crypt beneath the chapel. But rather than that, it became the offices, but it does explain why you go down a few steps to get to the offices. The old cornerstone was reset. It is right there today. When it was removed from the old church, there was a box inside, it had a copper lid on it, and it was inscribed, Church of the Heavenly Rest, erected in memory of Caroline Colby, faithful friend of Northern Texas, 1883. I don't know if we still have the lid to that box, but I hope that we do. That is Parson Gerhardt there. The chapel was finished on All Saints Day, which is November the 1st of 1954, and that's the name of the chapel. Later, someone thought to carve the location of the old church into the cornerstone. I know you can't read it, but it says North 4th in orange, which is a shame because it was on North 3rd in orange, but that's the type of thing, Ron, that confuses future historians right there. The rock from that downtown church was brought here, and if you go into the offices and you turn left, you can see that old rock that is now the foundation for the chapel walls there. Before the parish house, though, was even completed, Harold Martin had passed away in California, so Parson contacted Martin's old partner, Philip Froman, in Washington, D.C., to see if he would finish the job, and Mr. Froman politely said no. He had plenty to do, so he was not interested. But if you see a list of the churches that Philip Froman designed, you would find cathedrals in Baltimore, San Diego, Orlando, Trinity College Chapel there in Hartford, some other churches in Washington, D.C., and then way down there at the bottom, you'll see Heavenly Rest, Abilene, Texas, and you've got to think to yourself, there has to be a story there somewhere. Parson was not deterred by Froman's initial no. I once asked Parson Gerhardt's son, Harry, I said, how did your dad manage to get Froman to take on this project? And Harry said, well, I'll tell you, he bugged that man to death. But he did finally agree to come here. He came to Abilene in 1954 after the parish house was completed and the chapel was going up. That's him standing with Oscar Rose. Oscar Rose's family still members here. Oscar Rose was the only contractor who bid on the job. They're standing just right over there in front of the office doors. Of course, we still have all of his drawings. He drew 6 studies for what he thought this could look like. This was study number 1, and this is the one we went with. At the bottom, you can see it says both Harold Martin and Philip Froman's names. Helping them were local architects Tucker and Lindbergh. Jimmy Tittle worked for Tucker and Lindbergh at the time. The Parson and Philip Froman were just 2 years apart in age. I think they were of the same era. I think they saw the world much in the same way. And I think it didn't hurt that Froman had helped design his father-in-law's church some 40 years before that. The work began on the nave. Construction started on May the 27th of 53 and would take more than 3.5 years. It would cost around $650,000. It is considered Gothic, and Gothic just really means that you've got pointed windows and arches in your construction. Here's a picture of Parson. Oh, well, that's the chapel, that's the parish house, and way off over there is Sacred Heart Church, you can see in the distance. But this is Parson standing in the midst of his dream when it was going up. He once wrote this about a church. He said, the church is the most important structure in any city. It is the meeting place between heaven and earth, and the building itself should be a sermon in stone. 4 months after, before it was finished, Froman came here for a second time. He told a newspaper reporter that the church was similar in architecture to English churches built some in the Middle Ages. He said this church was built to last for at least 500 years. In fact, the east and west walls of the nave are some 3 feet thick. Froman said that the exterior gable niche, which is above the window on this side over here at the very top, it's got a 15th century canopy style over the top of it. He said that that was the crowning element of the whole church. The earliest drawings that he had showed that niche filled with a carved stone statue, but it remains empty. I'm not sure why. The stone is from Luters, and the stone carvers came here from Austin. The last stone to be put in place was the cross over that empty niche, and perhaps that's why it's empty, Dave. Maybe it's to remind us of Easter, I don't know. But it was on, let's go with that, because the statue is going to cost a lot of money, so. But it was on November the 25th of 1956 that the very first services were held in the nave, and over the years, as you can tell, we have adorned it. We have added stained glass, and many things have been given in memory of loved ones, and some of those stories behind those windows are very poignant. In fact, the future project of mine is to write down the stories of those people. The west window at the back of the nave was installed in 1966, and it shows a selection of New Testament miracles and parables, and they were all selected by Parson Gerhardt. And the window was given by the women of this church, along with some other Abilene friends, in honor of Parson Gerhardt. The big east window, or the Te Deum window, to God window, was given by the widow and the daughter of Einar Ungren. Mr. Ungren was a native of Sweden who moved here and got into the oil business. He passed away when he was pretty young, in 1953, I believe. But this was created by the Judson Studio of Los Angeles, and it was installed in 1958, and there is a whole lot to explain about that window, but we'll save that for another time. This is how it looked before the current reredos was in place, and there is the answer to my earlier question. That thing that's hiding the screen up there is that. It was the crest of the original reredos, and no, they did not have to cut the ends off for it to fit in that arch up there. Reredos may be a new word for you, and that's how you say it. It's not re-redos, it's reredos. It sometimes shows up in the crossword puzzle, but a reredos is a hooded screen behind an altar. The one that we now have was installed in 1981, crafted by a studio in Dallas, the William Schieffer Studio. The only other Abilene church that I know of that has one is Aldersgate down the sales here. Theirs is fabric. It's more like a curtain backing to it, but this is Schieffer's drawing for the reredos. And if you have forgotten, it depicts Cleopas and his unnamed companion on the road to Emmaus, following the resurrection, as described in the 24th chapter of Luke. The left panel shows those two walking down the road and discussing the empty tomb. The right panel shows them meeting up with a man whom they did not recognize as Jesus. Later that day, at the supper, is when it was revealed to them that, in fact, they were in the presence of Christ. That's Cleopas on the right. I suspect that Schieffer might have used Caravaggio's painting from the 1600s because the Cleopas and his friend kind of resemble those two men in the painting there. Schieffer also designed and created many of the details in the nave, including the pulpit and the railings, the paneling on the west wall. That's him there with Parson. There are a lot more historical details or architectural details, but again, that would be for another day. So if you've lost track of how things happened around here, here's the recap. The parish house went up first in 1952, and it was the one that was in progress when the architect passed away. But another important part of our church history got started there in the fall of '52. A day school was started. They started with 11 kindergartners. It grew very quickly to the point that they were occupying the entire building. Today, of course, it is St. John's School. The chapel came next. It was ready in October of '54, but Dick and Maisie Fletcher couldn't wait. They were married in there in July of 1954. The nave was finished in 1956. The very first wedding to take place in there was the wedding of Peggy Hardaway and Bob Beckham. At the time, there were no pews in there. There was just folding chairs. And as they walked and turned to walk back down the aisle, her dress caught on a folding chair, and she drug it all the way down the aisle. Of course, Bob and Peggy's remains are also in the columbarium back there. In 1970, the Quonset hut was removed, and it was replaced with the parish hall, now the music suite. There's a very inconspicuous plaque right over here where we store the food that tells you who the major donors were for that building. The bell tower was completed finally in 1983, although the first floor had been built with the nave in the 50s. In that first floor room was installed to be Parsons' view was that it would be a museum of the church. Today it's the home of the live stream studio. But those big Dutch bells, which are seldom seen by anybody anymore, although within the last few months I did get to go up in the tower, and I can report to you that they're not near as shiny as they are right there. 6 of those bells can be rung by pulling ropes on the second floor of the tower. The other 19 are part of a carillon. You can play them on a keyboard. And believe it or not, they're actually programmed to play by somebody in Dallas. I don't know who that is, but somebody in Dallas programs what happens every day at 3:15 here. The columbarium was added through the efforts of Rosemary Suttle in 1997, and it was later enlarged in 2013. My wife and I happen to live right behind it, and I walk over there a lot. I also walk to these 3 things a lot. And I don't remember, but finally, this space, the Gerhard Hall and the courtyard, were finished in 2017, and it took the place of the old parish hall. And if you've ever wondered why there's a chimney on the outside of this building when there's no fireplace in here, it's because it's hiding some mechanicals, and it's to mimic the chimney there, which also is not connected to a fireplace, and it was put there to mimic this chimney, which in fact does serve a real fireplace over there. I suggested at the start that the 17th century azulejo up there was one of the top 5 oldest. Here are the ones that predate it very quickly. Number 4, and all of these are, besides the azulejo, the rest of these are here because of Parson Gerhard. He fought to get them and tracked them down. This brick from the first Episcopal Church in this new world, from the church there in Jamestown, and this is how that tower looked in 1900. It's still standing, but that brick is now set in the wall of the first floor tower room. Also next to it is a rock or a tile from the Canterbury Cathedral in England, dating, they think, from around the 10th century. Of course, that's the spiritual leader of the church, is the Archbishop of Canterbury, that being his home church. Coming in next is the stone set in the floor in front of the altar. It weighs 390 pounds. It came from King Solomon's quarry. The president of Texaco, whose brother lived in Abilene, is responsible for that. Parson Gerhard asked him if he could talk to the director of antiquities in Jordan, and he did, and it was shipped here. And finally, perhaps the oldest, although it's hard to say because it's hard to date a rock, but anyway, the stones in the altar from Mount Sinai are also there. There are actually 2 sets of stones. One were picked up by a lady from Abilene named Mary Berger, who has a very interesting story. In fact, Berger Street is her family street. And the others came from a man in Wichita Falls who got them from a girl who climbed to the top of Mount Sinai. But incorporating all the past into this church was something Parson Gerhard really set his mind to see be done. He liked the Old Testament reminders, the church history reminders, the physical connection that we have to Canterbury and to Jamestown, even to Matagorda, which is where the first Episcopal Church in Texas was located. That white panel came from that church, which burned in the about 1830s. It is now set in a door in the tower room. During the later years of Parson Gerhardt's service, a curate was brought here in 1954. His name was Edward Denser. They called him Ted. He would follow Gerhardt and serve for 20 years. After him, Jim Foltz followed. He was later elected the Bishop of West Texas Diocese. He's still living in San Antonio. In fact, his son is the Bishop of South Dakota. Then David Puckett was here for 7 years. That was in the late 80s, early 90s, before he moved to Albuquerque, where he was the Dean of the Cathedral Church of St. John. And then for 18 months, we were without a rector until 1993, when Rodney Quainton, a Yale and Harvard graduate and a former banker turned priest, arrived. He was kind of a short timer. He later became a Methodist minister, and I think it might be our fault that all happened. But after him, Scott Mayer was then named as rector, and he served for 14 years before becoming the bishop. Luke Back followed him. Luke is now the rector at Church of the Holy Spirit in Lake Forest, Illinois, which brings us to today. And David, who is not only my favorite, but he's the tallest and has the best singing voice of all of them. So, but I believe on your table are some questions that you're supposed to discuss now. So, Mary, you can have them discuss.